Hello, and welcome to Other Voices Online, a monthly conversation for activists. Other Voices is brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Actually, for the next several weeks, these monthly conversations will be a bit more frequent. We're embarking on a special series of webinars to examine how activists might organize ourselves in the coming years to confront and resist a new Trump administration. Although given the actions of what's happened in the last couple of days, maybe we need to amend that to the new Elon Musk administration. In any event, each of these webinars will focus on a different area of activism, and we begin tonight with climate action. Most people will recall that one of Trump's first actions relating to climate change, his first time around, was his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. He's expected to repeat that action early in his new term. But a lot of people might be unaware that he attempted to repeal or roll back over 125 environmental regulations during his first term in office, something he's also expected to repeat in the coming months. But there are many areas where we can continue to be effective as activists in confronting climate change. To help us understand where those opportunities might arise, I'm really pleased to welcome back Janet Cox of Climate Action California, a statewide organization advancing science-based climate policy. Climate Action California is engaged at every level of government, local, regional, state, and federal. Welcome back to Other Voices, Janet Cox. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Paul.
So why don't we start out and have you, since it's been over a year since you were on, take 60 seconds to tell people what Climate Action California does, what your program is, how you work, who you are.
Well, Climate Action California is indeed statewide. We are completely volunteer driven. I'm a volunteer. We have a small amount of staff that supports the volunteers, but we have this somehow wonderful people with a lot of dedication and expertise come to us with ideas about using the science and the law to really move on climate, and we try to give everybody as much agency as we can. When we've had some really interesting success in the past year, and we haven't been functioning as Climate Action California for a very long time. We were part of 350 Silicon Valley for several years before we realized we were statewide and broke off into a statewide organization. But it's an interesting model because a lot of other organizations raise money to pay staff to do the work. We raise money to pay staff to support the volunteers who do the work.
Yeah, it's a nice model.
It's super. It's really, and it's a great community. And we have wonderful new people showing up all the time, and it's our job to give everybody something to do that makes.
Okay, well, we'll talk a bit more about that later on. You did back various climate action heroes in the recent elections, in state elections and stuff. How'd you do on that?
Well, we did pretty well. We endorsed 25 candidates for the state legislature, and 20 of them won.
All right, not a bad record.
So the reason we did that was because we lost some battles in the legislature last year. There were many times when committee action diluted or outright killed important legislation. And so Palo Alto's own state senator, Josh Becker, came to us at one point and said, "You probably ought to form a PAC and start endorsing candidates." We said, "Okay, I think that's a good idea, really." And then we did. And we raised over $100,000 to support the
Wow.
candidates who needed the most help. Not everybody we endorsed needed help, but we tried to share, do more work and make some contributions to the candidates who did need help. And it was great. And we learned some things, and I think we'll probably start earlier next time, get more involved in the primary. And we all need to be thinking about the next governor of California.
That's very true. That's very true.
So,
Let's turn to the topic at hand. And the first thing I was going to ask you to try to look into your crystal ball and predict is where we're going to expect the most trouble from a new Trump regime or Trump administration, and what else you think where the attacks might be coming from. But I have a guess what the first one might be, and that's just a recent announcement by President Biden of expanding our emission reduction goals nationally to now say that we will get to 66% below 2005 emission levels by 2035. Is that right? And
oh, yeah, that's the contribution that is required to be specified by the Paris Agreement.
uh,
It still isn't. I mean, I wish it was higher, and I wish we were giving more money to the Green Climate Fund, which is the mechanism for the wealthy countries to be trying to help the smaller, poorer island nations and other places that are really going to be hit tremendously hard.
that's been a major bone of contention at the COP meetings, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And we're not making enough progress. And I think, having the last few COPs being chaired by oil barons doesn't help anybody's credibility, and it's not very constructive. So the COPs have been pretty disappointed.
Right. So what about this Biden announcement, though, of these
Well,
increasing target, these much
I don't know.
stronger targets?
If Trump pulls out again, I suppose he can just say, who cares?
Right. All that's off the table.
But I think that in terms of climate action, it seems like Biden is moving as hard and fast as he can, the whole administration, to try to head off the worst of what everyone expects Trump to try to do. The fact that the EPA approved California's clean air waivers yesterday
Uh-huh.
is a big deal. And it's just
Explain what the clean air waivers are that got approved.
so California, because of its terrible air quality, especially in the Los Angeles area, has had waivers from the federal government for decades, allowing us to set air quality standards that are more stringent than the rest of the country. And so the two that got reapproved yesterday, because they'd been up for renewal, was one that allows us to keep the CAFE standards higher, which will support Newsom's determination to only sell EVs by 2035 in California.
Right.
And the other one, which is a NOx waiver, will support the Clean Trucks action that CARB passed last year. So, California we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And I think we're all very lucky to be working on climate in this state because we're big enough to make a difference and we're blue enough to make some good decisions. And people look to us as leaders on climate. Now, whether we're leading to the extent that we were a few years ago, like under Jerry Brown, I think maybe we were doing better. But we still got, we're sort of coasting on our laurels. And this is the place to be doing this work because a lot of people are watching California. And so I think that should keep us all going.
I think a lot of this conversation is going to focus on California because of that, and it presents opportunities for us as residents of California to weigh in on some significant possible legislation. But
Right.
before we get to what might happen in California, let's talk about what might happen in Washington. And one of Trump's earliest announcements for his new cabinet, unlike the first time around, it was Lee Zeldin, former congressman for the Environmental Protection Agency, and Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, for the Interior Department. Your thoughts on these two gentlemen?
Well, they're probably not as bad as Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr.
And Kash Patel and the rest of the
Oh
cabinet.
my God. Well, Kash Patel isn't in the cabinet, but yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think it's going to be tough. I mean, I think that, you know, Trump doesn't seem to recognize that we're already producing more fossil fuels than anybody else on the planet. What's he talking about when he keeps saying he's going
Drill,
to
baby,
drill,
drill.
baby, drill?
Yeah.
I don't know. We're going to fight him in the courts. And of course, the courts are not what they could be these days. But, he had a lot of trouble getting policies through in the first term. I mean, they're a little bit more organized now, and maybe Doug Burgum is smarter than, I don't know. It's hard to imagine. I shouldn't say this because I'm sort of professionally gullible. I mean, I'm always surprised that things get as dreadful as they get. I don't know why I'm always surprised, um, but I look at this and there's a lot of momentum toward climate action. One of the smart things that Biden did with the Inflation Reduction Act is that all of those climate projects, they're distributed through every congressional district in the same way that the defense operations were organized decades ago.
Yeah, I looked that up and I wanted to talk to you about the Inflation Reduction Act and what might survive out of that. And one of the things I came across is that there are currently 215 projects in Republican districts
Mhm.
that have been funded as opposed to 119 in Democratic districts. So that's buying a lot of congressional support, I would think, but does it translate that way?
Well, we don't know because the Republicans that are in those districts have apparently lost their minds. I mean, I don't know who we're up against here, but you know, I it's 2 years, it's less than 2 years now to the midterms. And a lot
Mhm.
of these chickens are going to come home to roost and fall right off their perches when the the policies that Trump and Musk are insisting on take shape.
Yeah, and don't deliver what people,
See how they can.
yeah,
No,
yeah,
it's the opposite. I mean, I was canvassing in Reno before the election, and there was this one woman I was talking to when I was just trying to explain to her in the simplest possible terms what a tariff was. And she just said I was wrong. China will pay. And there was this,
yes,
what
yeah,
could I say? I mean, I don't know.
yeah. So the total of the Inflation Reduction Act on climate projects, climate-oriented projects, is a total of 350 projects in 40 states for $265 billion. And I've got to think that a lot of these Republican congressional representatives who ran out and took credit for at these groundbreakings and stuff are going to be a little loath to see these projects shut down. Is that an area where we might find some agreement in Congress?
Well, you mean, will the Congress push back against shutting down those programs?
Right.
It's probably, I think that from what I've been gathering, the Biden administration has been pushing that money out the door as fast as they can.
Uh-huh.
It's a smart thing to do. And once it's out the door, they're not going to get it back. So I think it's going to be hard to stop this progress. And the other thing to realize is that, the whole economy is involved in fighting climate change to a significant extent. Businesses, others, lots of states. I mean, if we're really going to solve the problem, the solutions are going to be decentralized anyway to a considerable extent. So I'm just not sure that Trump is going to be able to stop progress. And he'll slow it down. And the stupid, mindless Republicans may be working against their own best interests with their constituents. But I don't know. I kind of hope that Trump stays alive and JD Vance doesn't become president, because
Yeah, that's a whole other series of webinars when we get to
another
that point.
one.
But yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. It seems like actual economic benefits of converting to clean energy are being felt in red and blue districts all across the country. That it's becoming part of, as you put it, our economy. It's a major part of our economy.
To be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And plus the disasters are striking everywhere. And we've always said that Congress doesn't really move until the problem hits them in person in their districts. But unfortunately, we're all in the bullseye here.
Yeah, that's true. Um,
But so Jerry Brown was interviewed a few days ago, I think, at a PPIC event or something, and he said that he thinks that he's looking forward to the backlash against Trump trying to pull all this back. He thinks that it's going to be a short step backwards and then the release of a lot of energy to fix it and go faster for the next president, or even in 2 years.
huh.
But it was pretty neat to.
Yeah, where can you see this interview with Jerry Brown?
I read about it, and I think
Oh,
it was in Politico, California, but I can look it up and let you know.
yeah. We send out a follow-up email to all our attendees, all
It,
our registrants for these. And I think that's something people would be interested
It may,
in hearing.
the interview may be available online, and if so, that we should all listen to it.
Yeah, we can send a link to it.
Yeah.
So talking about different states, and before we focus on California, there was some heartening news that came out of these elections in terms of state ballot measures. California, for example, overwhelmingly approved the $4 billion environmental funds with Proposition 4.
$10 billion.
10 billion. I'm sorry. I was thinking Proposition 4 and it got in the way. $10 billion. You want to just talk about what that's going to mean for California, and then I want to mention a couple other states and get your reactions.
Well, it was really important to pass it because the legislature was under the gun because there was such a severe deficit last year. And so the bond will cover a lot of the things that probably would have been in the budget if we'd had the surpluses we've been having for a few years.
Uh-huh.
You know, there's always a push-pull between mitigation and adaptation. And for a long time, we said, oh, we only want to pay for mitigation, which would essentially slow the advance of climate change. I think we've reached the point where the adaptation is simply necessary because people are being hurt all the time.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was a little bit more adaptation than mitigation in that bond, but I think it'll make a difference. It won't all be paid out at once. I think it's over 10 years that I'm not sure what the payout period is, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, we will keep going. And then there's the loan that PG&E just got from the federal government to fund some of the things that they'd rather not have to do, like distributed energy and batteries. But
I'm not sure how many in our audience have seen this. This is recent news. I think it was just on Tuesday that it was announced that the Energy Department has granted PG&E $15 billion to expand hydropower generation, battery storage, as you mentioned, upgrade transmission lines. And to me, and maybe you can explain a little bit about how this might work, what's called virtual power plants, where they take existing home solar installations and things like that and bundle them together. Apparently, PG&E is having trouble figuring out what to do with individuals now generating power.
This is a really touchy subject for a lot of people. I don't know whether any of those virtual power plants exist, but the idea is to, look at a neighborhood with a lot of rooftop solar and what we know is that when I generate more solar than I need, it's shared right in the local neighborhood.
Uh-huh.
So that works that way anyway. But I think virtual power plants, I don't know whether surely those should reduce the need for transmission. But Paul, I think you need to have a different webinar about this with people smarter about it than I am.
Okay.
Because
well,
it's a great topic, and the whole business about how the utilities support what's called distributed energy resources, which is both rooftop solar and far-flung solar farms, how they deal with those resources and how they distribute the costs among ratepayers. It's just a huge complicated topic that a lot of people are very emotional about, and it's challenging to have a factual discussion about it because people are PG&E is a very unpopular character.
Yes. Yes, especially when that bill arrives each month, they get a little more unpopular.
Mhm.
So let's spend some time on looking at the tea leaves for California in the coming period, because as you mentioned, um, we're kind of a vanguard state on climate change action. Um, what is what are you as Climate Action California looking for out of the legislature in the coming sessions?
Well, one thing that seems pretty sure to happen in 2025 is the legislature is going to start taking a hard look at cap and trade. And the last time cap and trade was reauthorized was in 2017. We're um, we're starting early toward the 2030 expiration date for the current program, but there are a lot of problems with cap and trade. And the legislature has already had a number of hearings where they brought the CARB director in to try to explain why the program isn't working better. You know, there are all kinds of
Explain
problems.
what CARB is.
The California Air Resources Board,
Okay.
which is really at the heart of a lot of California's climate policy, and they're a little difficult to work with under Newsom. They were better under Jerry Brown when
Huh.
Mary Nichols was the chair.
Can,
But
can you take a minute to just explain what California's cap and trade program is, how it works right now?
so cap and trade in the simplest sense allows a company that is polluting less to sell credits to an entity that is polluting more, with the idea that over time, the value of those credits will decrease as everyone pollutes less. And it's just always tricky. Pricing those credits fairly
Uh-huh.
it turns into a political debate. But I think what we have seen for a long time in California is that there are also a certain number of free credits that are offered to sort of prime the pump. And there are way too many free credits, and
Huh.
it's possible for a company to put them in the bank for a long time after they've bought them. So the kind of grossest criticism of cap and trade is that you're essentially allowing people to pay to pollute. And there has to be a way to make it more efficient in the sense of actually reducing emissions. And that probably means expiring credits or higher prices for credits. It's California is pointed to as one of the few places that has a continuing cap and trade program. We're actually in league with Quebec in this one. And the state of Washington has just passed a cap and trade program that I think we're going to try to hook up with. So there are all kinds of opportunities to change the program and make it more effective and efficient. And
Do you
that's going
think
to be a big focus of the legislature this coming year, or so we hear.
it does sound like that's going to take a lot of attention? Will that be like what they're going to do, or are there other bills in the pipeline that we should be?
Well, there's tons of bills in the pipeline. One of the interesting things that happened last week is that the leadership of both houses said that they were going to limit the number of bills that each member can introduce to like 35 in the Assembly and 45 in the Senate for the whole 2-year session. And believe it or not, that feels like kind of a strict diet to a lot of these folks who have just been, I mean, there's just thousands of bills that try to make their way through the system every year. Hopefully, with a limit that's announced early in the session, we were having a conversation with an Assembly member Isaac Bryan from LA, Culver City area yesterday or a couple of days ago. And we were saying maybe this will actually inspire legislators to talk to each other before they introduce bills. So you don't have 5 bills that are trying to do the same thing and are all a little bit different, then the committees have to try to sort them out. But there are
Yeah,
lots of
that would
things
be helpful. Yeah.
you'd think, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the bills that didn't make it last year, but that we are very determined to try to bring back this year, was a polluter pays bill that, based on the emissions that the big 5 oil companies, no, that's wrong. It's a larger number of oil companies, but based on the emissions that they actually, that can be documented between about 2000 and 2022, they were going to apportion fees, which people were trying to describe as taxes, which are politically difficult to pass. Anyway, they were going to require these companies to actually pay into a fund that would support mitigation and adaptation into the communities that are hard hit, especially the environmental justice communities, which are always hit first and worst because of where they end up being.
Uh-huh.
Vermont has passed such a bill. There's one coming up in the state of New York. If California could pass a polluter's pay bill, it would be fabulous. So that's something else we're going to try to do this year. There's also a lot of interest in ending the state subsidies in the budget for oil and gas, which may also take a bill to do. And
How
that
much are we paying in subsidies to oil and gas companies?
Actually, we don't know, but Assemblymember Damon Connolly from Marin County has asked the Department of Finance to produce a report that actually says how much. And we're hoping to see that maybe by the end of the year.
What are these subsidies for? It's just shocking to me that California is subsidizing big oil at this point. We know we've got a lot of oil in this state. You drive to Southern California, and Southern California is pretty much where the oil industry started.
Yeah, I mean, Los Angeles is a city plunked down on a giant oil field.
Yeah. So what is the subsidy program? What are these supposed to be accomplishing?
Well, one of them is called Water's Edge, which says that a company can only be taxed on its oil and gas revenues strictly within the state of California. But in the case of multinational, huge companies, that's maybe just a tiny bit of their revenues. I think this is another great topic for oil and gas subsidies. And once we get this report, I think it'll be a lot easier to see what they all are. But, it's just all kinds of things. It's like, giving oil companies incredibly cheap leases on state
Uh,
land to,
uh-huh.
or
Sweetheart deals.
yeah, all kinds of things and the oil industry's been running the table in this country for an awful long time, and they have worked their deals everywhere.
Yeah.
And California is a very oily state, so I think it would make
So
a difference if we could cut those subsidies.
that would be great. So that's one to keep an eye on as we're keeping track of our state legislature, cut these subsidies. I do want to get to our audience with their questions and comments, but I did want to ask one more thing about what you've got on your priorities list, at least according to your website, and that would be updating Cal Green, which is California's Green Building Code. Do you want to mention
Right.
that briefly?
So, passive house, we spell it HOUSE, but I think it started in Europe and it's spelled HAUS,
Uh,
is a strategy for creating a kind of a parallel, a, sort of a parallel version of the state building code that goes straight to much more energy efficient buildings that should be cheaper to build and cheaper to run without the need for as much heating and air conditioning as a lot of our houses have. So this is something that some of our volunteers have been working on for quite a while and are now hoping to find an author for a bill that will make this alternative. It's sort of, I don't know whether it's within Title 24, which is the state building code, or whether it's just kind of next to it. But this will make a big difference because we have a huge need to build a lot more housing.
Absolutely.
That
And
housing needs to be as efficient as possible.
absolutely. Two main themes coming up. Okay, let's get our audience involved in here. Um, Welcome to have your questions or comments, what your thoughts are on where we need to be focusing on for climate change in the coming period. There's two ways you can participate. First one is click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and you will get a message from our director to that you will be allowed to unmute, and then I'll call on you and you can just ask your question. Or you can type in a question by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom and type out a question, and I'll keep track of those and I'll read those off to Janet. So raise hand or Q&A, and I don't see any hands up yet, but hopefully they will come soon. Well, it's telling me there's a hand up, but I don't see it.
Dave Page.
David Page.
Well,
Hi, can you hear me?
oh yes, David P. I
Sorry.
was scrolling up high enough. Hi, David. Welcome.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Janet. Janet,
David.
I was wondering if you could explain the latest with the Scott Wiener bill that Newsom signed, I guess reluctantly, about the big oil companies disclosing how much pollution they make every year. Or could you say a little bit about that? Because this latest thing with the whoever it is, the state agency, saying they're not going to enforce the law, even though it's a law. It's hard for me to understand.
Yeah, David, I didn't see that, but what I saw is that CARB is requesting information to use as they figure out how to implement it. But you may have seen something, you must have seen something different than I.
Yeah, it was just a couple of days ago. CARB said they're going to delay implementing the law until I don't know, 2026 or something like that. And anyway,
Well,
it's a little hard to understand, like how.
okay, so I can just talk a little bit about those disclosure bills. So, so there were two bills, SB 253 by Scott Wiener, which requires companies bigger that are doing revenues more than $1 billion to disclose their climate, to disclose their emissions. And those would be scope 1 and 2 emissions initially, and then scope 3 emissions, which are the big ones. And I can explain what those scopes are later if you like. A year or so later. That's one bill. The other bill was Senator Henry Stern's SB 261, which required companies doing more than $500 million in $500 million in revenues to disclose their climate-related financial risk. And we worked really hard to get those two bills passed, and they were ultimately passed. To our amazement, Newsom signed them. And they tried last year to delay them practically indefinitely because of the budget crisis, and Scott Wiener, as the chair of the budget committee in the Senate, absolutely didn't allow that to happen. So they did delay implementation for a year, but that's not really surprising because it takes CARB a long time to build one of these programs. And I think it's still going to happen. In the meantime, the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission attempted to have some kind of disclosure requirement, and they weren't able to pull it off because there was so much political opposition in Washington. So I think, California is going to move ahead with these bills, and we're really going to be leading the nation. And I trust showing the SEC how this should be done. So we're going to be following the CARB's process of figuring out how to implement those bills extremely carefully. This is hugely important for the whole nation, I think. But I didn't hear that yes, they're not going to implement them immediately, but they always have to build a program before they can implement anything. So I think it's still going to happen.
You've mentioned, and thank you for the question, David. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. You've mentioned CARB, the California Air Resources Board, several times now. Is that a body that takes public comment? Is this an area where you don't seem to be real impressed with CARB yourself?
Actually, we had a great year with CARB this year. It was sort of amazing. So one of the things that Climate Action California tries to focus on 3 areas: short-lived climate pollutants, which are principally methane and refrigerants, transportation electrification, and the kinds of measures like the disclosure bills, which will hasten the transition to a low carbon economy. And so we work hard on methane. And there has been a big tussle going on for a long time about whether CARB was going to regulate methane from agriculture. And in California, where we have more dairies, I think, than any other place in the country, agricultural methane is the largest source of methane from California. And so the dairy lobby is extremely strong. And finally, a couple of our volunteers, a retired environmental attorney who worked for years in the Attorney General's office and then at CARB, and a retired researcher who just has the most capacious brain I ever heard of, put together a formal petition to CARB to ask them to regulate agricultural methane, as they very arguably should be doing based on a law that was passed in 2016, SB 1383. And so they put this petition together. We submitted it to CARB. This is not the kind of petition that a lot of people sign. This is a 37-page legal document. And we got an answer back. CARB was required to respond to the petition in a month. And we got an answer back in about 3 weeks that asked for 3 more months to comment. And we gave them 2 more months. And at the end of 2 months, at the very end of 2 months, they sent us a letter, said, thank you very much. And yeah, but nah, not really. And then we started meeting with CARB board members to sort of talk this out. And one by one, we had these wonderful conversations with them. They were really nice people who care a lot about air quality in California and the climate, and weren't really used to pushing back on staff. And ultimately, they did. So what happened finally was that they had the CARB board had a meeting with the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which they set up under statute a few years ago, and which they kind of listen to when they have to, where a number of board members sat up and said they were all in favor of actually regulating agricultural methane. And we'd heard in some of our meetings that board members were not at all happy with CARB, with the staff's response to our petition. And so after 7 or 8 board members, and I think there's a total of 13, made comments in this informational meeting about how they really thought it was time and important to regulate this huge source of methane, staff came up with a resolution that agreed to essentially do that later than we'd hoped, but they're going to do it. And then there was kind of a poison pill at the end of the resolution that showed up at the last minute that a couple of board members tried to get removed and were not successful in doing that. But basically, their CARB is going to regulate agricultural methane, and arguably it's because of our petition and our endless meetings with board members and our testimony at hearings. And I think it really matters. I think the board members care what the public thinks, and they are open to reasonable, logical, legal arguments. And this was pretty incredible.
Well, that's great to hear. Grassroots power in action.
Absolutely.
We've got a excellent question here in the Q&A box from Michael. He says, I was delighted to hear you raised $100,000 for your PAC. Could you compare that to the political spending by Sierra Club, California Environmental Voters, and other environmental PACs versus political spending by the fossil fuel industry and the building trades unions? So Michael's hoping you have a lot of campaign finance info at your fingertips, but I think you get the point of his question. It's interesting.
Well, we're just little, and we're just learning, and we'd never done this before. It was a great learning experience. We had to hire an elections lawyer that we talked to like 4 times a day for 2 months, and a professional treasurer to handle all of the reporting that had to be done. It was really gratifying to raise that amount of money.
I'll bet.
We spent it mostly on social media, on influencers who put together some really neat and often hilarious videos for TikTok or Facebook or something. It was really quite interesting. So we pushed out a lot of these videos, and we recruited volunteers from our mailing list to canvass in a bunch of districts. And it was, it was kind of, it was sort of a humble effort. And we learned a lot. And what we decided was that next time we have to start a lot earlier. We have to get more involved in the primary, because we probably would have done better if we had more actively promoted primary candidates who we thought were going to be real climate champions.
Yeah.
And we'll try to raise more money, but I don't think you can compare what we did to the larger, much better funded, longer established organizations. But it was a great effort. And the other thing that, of course, well, we were really the only group that was endorsing specifically candidates to the state legislature. The Sierra Club and environmental voters endorse all up and down the ballot. But we were really focused on the legislature, and that seemed to me to be kind of a selling point, because the legislature is where we do most of our work, and we know that we need to get better people on some of those committees. And plus, by endorsing these folks and producing videos about them and sending them money, we now have great relations with a lot of new members of the legislature. And I think it's going to help us next year just be more effective. But it's a nice question, Michael, but we're really we're relatively small potatoes, and maybe we're even new potatoes in this business, but it was a good thing to do.
All right. Well, it sounds like an excellent start, and you have ideas on how to improve that kind of effort. So I'm not seeing any more hands raised or questions in the box. So I guess what I'll do is just ask you to take a couple of minutes to, where is your head at as you're looking at the future with a climate change denier coming back into the White House? What keeps you going these days?
Well, I'm spending way too much time on fundraising at the moment, because it's the end of the year. But so we've done this kind of an amazing thing. I don't think it's overstating it to say that we have built a statewide community. We meet on Zoom, which is a sad substitute for everybody coming over and having breakfast at my house. But we kind of make it work. And We meet twice a month on the second and fourth Tuesdays at 6 o'clock, and everybody's always welcome to come and talk about whatever they want to talk about. We have an agenda which we try to get through, but the meetings are really meaty and interesting. And no matter how tired I am at 5 o'clock on Tuesday, by the time that meeting is over, I am so ready to go because these people are wonderful.
All right.
Just amazingly wonderful people who are just trying to figure out what they can do to help. And it's so inspiring to have that kind of community to work on this terrifying problem with. It's just a gift. And
Yeah.
a gift to be doing it in California where it matters. And that's probably why we're all sticking to it. But somehow we just put together this bunch of people who have a good time working on hard stuff together. And join us, see what it's like.
Yeah, it's a story I really like as a grassroots organizer. I think you're doing a fine job. I would encourage our viewers to check out the website. Give the website, Janet.
It's Climate Action California. It's climateactionca.org.
.org. And they also put out an excellent newsletter, and we'll send you links again in our follow-up email to everybody who registered for this webinar. Our next special webinar for looking at the new Trump era will be on December 30th. We'll be welcoming Professor Joel Bainan, who will be talking about Palestine solidarity in a new Trump era, as well as the really complicated situation currently in the Middle East. Professor Bainan's one of the leading authorities on the history of the region and especially the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I hope you'll join us for that on December 30th. And with that, I will say thank you to Sean in the background for keeping everything working properly here. Thank you to Janet Cox of Climate Action California. Great to chat with you again, Janet. And thanks to all of you who tuned in. We'll see you next time on December 30th. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Good night.